Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our first installment of virtual staff devotions. We're hoping to meet in the future on Zoom so that we can share prayer requests live, but for today at least, we're going to have to settle for a YouTube video. We find ourselves today in Mark chapter 9, verses 2 through 13. I want us to notice a few features of the text, and then I'll draw our attention to some points of application to our own situation here in the 21st century Clearwater quarantine. The first thing I want you to notice is here in verse 2, Mark includes this interesting time reference after 6 days. He doesn't always include these sort of temporal frames, but here he's drawing our attention to the events immediately preceding the transfiguration. And I think his point is that we can't truly appreciate the transfiguration unless we understand it in its context of Jesus' overall teaching on suffering. Now, it's been a while since Tyler walked us through this, so I want us to rewind to see a little bit of context of this story here. So if you notice in verse 29 of chapter 8, Jesus is alone with his disciples and he asks them this very pointed question: who do you say that I am? And Peter, on behalf of the disciples, responds perfectly: you are the Christ, you're the Messiah that we've all been waiting for. And he's right, Jesus is the Messiah, but Mark makes it pretty clear that Jesus is a different kind of Messiah than everyone was expecting. I mean, Peter and the others were fully expecting Jesus to come and overthrow the Roman government and establish his kingdom immediately. And so Jesus, he takes his time at the end of chapter 8 and he carefully explains to them that his ministry will be characterized by things like suffering and rejection, and he's even going to be killed, and then he's going to rise again from the dead. And this does not fit Peter's idea of what the Messiah will be like. And so Peter takes him aside and he begins to actually rebuke Jesus. But Jesus sets Peter straight and he teaches them that the Messiah's kingdom is not a political one. His kingdom is a spiritual one, and it will be marked by physical suffering. He explains to them that not only is the Messiah going to suffer and die, but all of his followers, if they're really interested in coming after Jesus, well, then they're going to need to deny themselves and pick up their own cross and follow Jesus in his suffering. So the disciples are clearly confused. We have to understand the kind of shock and disappointment that they've got to be feeling at this moment. I mean, they've left everything. They said goodbye to their families. They put their career on hold. They abandoned their friendships in order to follow Jesus because they were convinced that he was about to overthrow the Roman government and establish Israel as the world's greatest political power. Now, all of a sudden, Jesus is talking about suffering and death, and that doesn't fit their expectation of the Messiah. So they're confused, they're anxious, they're nervous, they're worried, and Jesus knows that they need some major encouragement. If they can't handle Jesus even talking about the crucifixion, how in the world will they ever survive watching their Messiah die on the cross? And so, after 6 days, Jesus takes a few of the disciples on a little field trip. And the four of them hike up to the top of a very high mountain by themselves. And the end of verse 2 says that Jesus was transfigured before them. The Greek word here is the word metamorpho. It's where we get our English word metamorphosis. Just like a caterpillar that is transfigured into a beautiful butterfly, Jesus is transfigured into his glorious, majestic, kingly appearance that he has enjoyed for all eternity in heaven. And there at the top of the mountain, God shows these three anxious, worried disciples exactly who the Son of Man really is. He knows that his disciples will need this powerful image of Jesus on his throne to sustain them while they watch him die on the cross. And there, suddenly, in the blackness of night, the darkness gives way to the radiant brilliance of the sun. Jesus' appearance is blinding. I mean, I can imagine the disciples there, with their faces towards the ground and their hands outstretched, trying to shield their eyes as their pupils strain to constrict. I mean, what is going on here? Mark's description of this scene is intended to conjure up Old Testament images of Yahweh God sitting in his heavenly throne room. Notice here this reference to Daniel chapter 7 and verse 9. If we click here, it says, in this vision, as I looked, the thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days, that is a reference to Yahweh, took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, and its wheels were burning fire. And here's Jesus. His clothes are radiant, intensely white, as no one on earth could ever bleach them. And then Elijah and Moses join the party, and they're there making small talk with Jesus. And Peter is probably feeling a little bit awkward, and he doesn't know exactly what to say, but that's never stopped him before. And so he butts into the conversation and he says, "Rabbi, teacher, it is so great that we're here. Tell you what, let us make 3 tents, and let's have ourselves a good old-fashioned sleepover right here on the mountain." Mark lets us know that he said this because he didn't know what to say, because they were terrified. And this cloud is there. It's overshadowing the mountain, just like it was when Moses met with Yahweh on the top of Mount Sinai. And a voice comes thundering out of the cloud and says, "This is my beloved Son," just like it did when Jesus was being baptized. And so there's all these really cool connections to the past. And then just as suddenly as it all started, it's over. And so Jesus takes his disciples back down the mountain, and he concludes by teaching them about the nature of his messiahship once again. They ask him this question: why do the scribes say that Elijah must first come? He says, well, Elijah does come first to restore all things. Now, Jesus is referring to John the Baptist. John the Baptist is the Elijah who would come and restore everything. So he is going to come, but his ministry is going to be characterized by suffering. People are going to do to him whatever they please. And in the same way, the Son of Man is going to suffer and be treated with contempt. And then the story concludes. So what in the world can we draw from this story to apply to our own lives? Well, first of all, these disciples are nervous. They're anxious, they're worried, they're questioning, they're filled with doubts. And God knows that they need the exact same thing that we need in our own lives today. They needed, and we need, a clear vision of who Jesus really is. Jesus is the one upholding the universe with the word of his power, and yet Jesus takes notice when even the smallest sparrow falls to the ground. He is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the ending. He was dead, and now he's alive forever, and he's coming back. And this time he's going to come not as the suffering servant, but as the conquering king. He'll wipe away every tear from our eyes, and sin and sickness and sadness and death will be history. This is the picture of Jesus that we need to fill our minds up with as we go throughout the next several weeks of quarantine. Second, this story teaches us that Jesus came not always to meet the needs that we feel, but he comes to meet the deepest needs of our heart. Jesus is not here merely to break down viruses. He's here to break down the sin of doubt and worry and unbelief and anxiety that exists in our own hearts. Like a master sculptor, Jesus picks up his hammer called COVID-19, and he takes up his chisel called 3 weeks of quarantine, and he goes to work. He's looking for imperfections to remove. His eyes find all the rough edges that are threatening to spoil his masterpiece, and he pounds them away. To us, it might seem easier if he would just focus more on the problem at hand, get rid of the coronavirus so we can all go about our ordinary lives. But maybe that's the point. Maybe we're far too satisfied with our ordinary view of Jesus. Maybe God wants us to know that Jesus is far more than ordinary. So let's take a few moments to just stay here on the top of the mountain, to behold Jesus in his majesty and his beauty and his sovereign power. Let's see Jesus for who he really is. And then let's go about our day in complete trust that he has everything under control. When the coronavirus is but a distant memory, it is this Jesus who will sustain us for the rest of our lives. God bless. Have a wonderful day.